What's going on, everybody? So I'm really here just to have a discussion about why I got the R6 Mark II from Canon. There's a lot of reasons why people get cameras and why they, choose an ecosystem, one or the other, but I want to explain my personal experience and what I went through and how I'm here. And so maybe it will help somebody by having this little discussion. And the Canon ecosystem is something I've been involved with since 2015, I would say. My wife and I, we picked up a 5D Mark III Canon, and we started shooting with that. And we had a little business with photography, and we didn't know any better because we came from a crop sensor Nikon. It was our first Canon camera and first full frame ever. And so far, everything was good. 2008 comes around, making some headway. She's doing mostly portrait work, and she does a lot of newborn stuff. The EOS R came out, and it was Canon's first attempt at a mirrorless system, and I was all in. There was a lot of good things that I saw, and a lot of people were bashing that camera at the time. And, I was watching a lot of YouTube videos, and it gets kind of rough because people have, a lot to say. And then all of a sudden you notice a year goes by, and then everybody's going back to the Canon and saying we were wrong. And I notice this kind of stuff happens a lot. And that's why I think that these kind of little discussions are really important for just an average to middle class kind of photographer and videographer, talking about these things where we're not swayed one way or another because we get anything for free, and we can just have this little discussion. So I loved that camera. It wasn't perfect. A lot of things aren't perfect, but the pictures, 30 megapixel pictures, full frame camera, it was pretty darn good. We were happy with it. Like I said, this was mostly portrait work. We controlled lighting. I used it for live streaming, and I also used it for some of my earlier videos when I wasn't using my Canon M50 or my M50 Mark II. And so I would mess with it, use it for video. The videos looked really clean, really nice. And I was getting some compliments on the improvements over the M50. I want to make an improvement, and I think what I was going to do was sell my Canon and go for a Sony A7 IV. I was ready to sell off the lenses that we have accumulated, which at that point now we have a 50 millimeter lens, an 85 millimeter lens, a L series 28 to 70 millimeter lens, and a 70 to 200 millimeter lens, all EF, all adapted lenses, and they worked fantastic. But I was ready to start by selling the camera, sell off the lenses, go to the Sony ecosystem, get the cameras that all have the same mount, because everything in my studio that I shoot with video, be it the ZV-E10, the ZV-1 is above me here for my overhead, and I have an A6400. And so we would have the E-mount on all the cameras, which can be useful. Canon is going that route now with their R10 and R7, and the R8 full frame just came out, which looks really impressive. And there we are, it's the same ecosystem, but the lenses are an issue still at this point, especially in the crop sensor. There's just not a ton to choose from at that point. So I've been using the EF, and it did well. And one plus, when I picked up the R6 Mark II, that was really beneficial to me, that made me feel good about going this route, was picking up this what you call mkii adapter. And what's really cool, it has an ND filter also. So right on the side here, I can pull this out, and here's my ND filter, and I can put other filters. And that was really something nice because it was affordable. Canon had this set up, but we were talking $400 for their setup, and that was a lot for me. And so to have this, in the, $100 range. I forget what I paid, but I'll put a link below, but it was much more affordable. And I was like, since I'm using adapted lenses and I get to use an ND filter too, that was fantastic. I'm actually want to pick up the Pro Mist filter that comes with this also. And that made it much more acceptable. The adapted lenses worked really well. And so I ended up going the R6 Mark II because it ended up coming out. I sold my EOS R. I had the money. I was ready to buy a used A7 IV. And even though I was all ready, I waited a little bit because I heard the rumors, and the R6 Mark II came out and they ended up selling out and I couldn't get my hands on it. But I went to B&H and I picked one up. And I think it was right from there when I handled this camera and then I handled the A7. I was just like, I need to know more about this. And so after I handled the camera, I loved its grip. I love the way it felt in my hand, and it does make a difference. And I also liked the Canon menu system, which if you've watched my channel at all, I always talk about how the Canon menu system is so much better. And I know people will say, well, the new menu system, it's so improved. And I get it. I mean, because I have the older crop sensors here and the menu system is the old system and they're struggling. And the new menu system is much better. So if you're a Sony person, you're like, whoa, this is like night and day. I get it. But I guess maybe I'm biased coming from Canon and the menu system and the way it operates. It just feels so intuitive and so comfortable. And I'm not the only one to feel that way, but that doesn't mean that someone would just pick the camera for that because everybody's got a lot of different reasons. Next thing was after the lens situation, which we don't even talk about the third party factor, which is a little bit bothersome. It's a little bit aggravating to me. No third party lenses. And so that's kind of upsetting because I think we could do better. Let me know in the comments what's your reason why you might have chose. But if I had bought the A7 IV, I would have not felt probably any worse about the factor. I just don't feel like you can make a mistake with either camera. Now, granted, I'm thrilled that the R6 has, 4K, 60 frames, no crop in video, which is great because it's kind of aggravating. I mean, I had a big crop in the EOS R, but also it's aggravating when you have a crop not at like say 4K 24, but then you get a crop at 4K 30 or 4K 60. That just changes your whole workflow. So knowing that in 4K, I could not have any crop at all versus the Sony, it was part of the reason because at this point now in the beginning, I was more about the photography for my full frame camera, but we've come to realize the videography is so much better now. And if I'm going to pay for a new camera, I'm going to want something that has some better video if I can. And so that was a big factor and it was really nice. And then the third thing that was a big standout was the fact that an electronic shutter, you could get 40 frames per second, which is ridiculous. So yeah, I know a lot of people are going to say, well, in sports, how usable is that? But we see that it's pretty usable in most situations. But in general, if you're using it for photography and portraits and you're in wedding scenarios, yep, it's going to get it. It's going to get the picture. The tracking is great. The focusing is great in video and in, photography. And it would be the same for the Sony. We wouldn't really say either way it would be any issue. Low light, I mean, we see the Sony is a tad better in low light situations. And in my scenario, it's really not that big of a deal. But I also feel that going from 30, megapixels to 23-ish with the Canon, people definitely have a little bit of an issue to say with that. But in my situation, it was never an issue with the Canon 5D Mark III. And so at this point, it's not going to be an issue for this. We never said, oh, I wish we had more megapixels back then. We weren't punching in 100% and getting any pixelation. So it really wasn't an issue. The other thing that I definitely would say is better that doesn't get spoken of enough. And even when we had the Canon EOS R, the R's digital stabilization was pretty darn good for what it was. It was pretty amazing for digital stabilization. And the stabilization in this camera is even, so much better. And in comparison to the Sony, I think that's one thing that it really lags behind. So if that is a difference, take note of that. Pay attention. If that is going to be something that's a factor for you in a hybrid camera, definitely the stabilization in this camera is a lot better. And so there are other things that annoy me a little bit too, because going back to the 40 frames, right? It's only as good as your buffer. And the great thing with the Sony is that you have the CF card slot, right? Much faster. Your buffer doesn't get exhausted. So even if you're shooting 12 frames a second, it would take forever to fill that buffer. I think they say you'll never fill it. It could be like 1,000 pictures. Whereas the buffer in here, because I'm stuck with, V90 SD cards, in about 2 seconds, it would be full at 40 frames per second. So you got to really pick and choose of when those things are usable for you and how they're usable. Not saying that you couldn't kick that back to 20 frames per second and you would get more seconds to fill your buffer. I would rather have the choice to make those decisions than not have that ability. So overall, the stabilization, the menu system, the 60 frames per second in 4K video with no crop were the main factors for me for picking the R6 Mark II. And at this point, after using it for 3 months, I haven't had any issues. Both cameras seem to be really do well with the overheating, so that wouldn't really be an issue for either or, whereas the R6 was a big factor, the original R6 with some overheating in the R5. And I know if you look hard enough, people will say they have an overheating issue, but the A7 IV has been far and few, and so that's not really a factor. The other great thing is that both cameras seem to have a pretty good battery life, and this is improved since the EOS R, and so I can use my old batteries, which is a good thing, and then I have the new batteries that also go in, and it's nice because I'm getting a good amount of life out of these batteries still. Both have pretty good viewfinders and pretty good screens for that matter. And until you go out to a camera shop, and I'm lucky enough to be in an area where I have multiple camera shops where I can pick these cameras up, I can hold them, I can feel them, and have enough people that I know that have shot with both of them. They like both cameras a lot, and for different reasons. And I'm not even getting into the deep part of different C logs that are available and S logs that are available and not available. And people will somewhat complain if they don't have a decent, powerful enough computer to run some of the codecs in here that are running it on DaVinci and doing editing. I haven't had any issues. I do have some fairly decent computers, so that hasn't been an issue for me in any way. I think those things are the main things of why I was fortunate enough to not jump right into the Sony A7 IV and jump into the R6 Mark II. And I'm happy with my decision. Everybody's going to have a different factor. So if you're starting from ground zero, there's all these things to consider. The lens, the third-party lenses, are they going to let people start making the RF mount? How are you using your camera? Are you more video-sided or are you more photography-sided? Those kind of things will always be a factor of why you'll choose one or the other. And I'm just curious, what may be your reason? Below, please leave a comment if you can, and let me know your reason and why you chose one way or another. Because it's a hard decision, but to be really honest with you, in the end, either way would have been a fine decision because they are both great products. So I wasn't here to say like this camera is so much better, but I'm pretty happy about the factors that I chose. And I'm sure the people that own the Sony a7 IV would feel the same. So I just really want to say thanks for stopping in and having this discussion with me. I appreciate any comments that you might leave down below that would be insightful for other people to read, because we all know we watch these videos and a lot of times go into the comments and people have really good reasons for things and bring up things that we may miss in these videos. We'll catch you on the next video. I appreciate your time. Thanks and have a great day.